Every week, 2 small wolf princes vanished from Ashkam Castle. They never disappeared for long enough to frighten anyone, just long enough for the whole castle to go looking. They were never far. Just past the west wall, down the narrow lane no noble ever bothered to walk, there stood a small stone house with a garden so modest no one would have guessed who lived there. That was exactly why it mattered. Inside, a woman who commanded the king's entire guard put down her sword at the door and picked up a mixing bowl instead. She had been baking the same apple pie for 10 years, a tradition that kept certain memories alive long after the people behind them were gone. It was last spring, when 2 small wolves first caught the scent of it drifting past the castle walls. They had been following it ever since. The king never worried when they disappeared. He knew they never went far. They never left the kingdom, never strayed beyond what a king could quietly account for. Until the week he decided to see for himself exactly where they went. This is the story of a woman, a captain everyone respected, and an alpha who spent years protecting a kingdom before realizing the place he longed to return to had been waiting just beyond his own castle walls. Some people make a place feel like home. Chapter 1. Ashkam Castle prided itself on routine. The gates open on time. The guard changed shifts on time. Lessons began on time and ended on time, and no one, not even the youngest kitchen boy, questioned why things were done the way they had always been done. Which made it all the more remarkable that, without fail, 2 small wolves ignored every one of those routines the moment a certain smell reached the castle walls. Cyrus was the first to notice it. He would go still in the middle of whatever he was doing, chasing a moth, arguing with his brother about nothing at all, and lift his nose, and that was the only warning anyone ever got. Cetus never noticed first. He simply trusted his brother's nose more than his own, and ran the moment Cyrus did. That was the difference between them, if anyone had bothered to look closely enough to find one. Cyrus led. Cetus followed. And when they ran, small white shapes low to the ground, ducking between the legs of guards who had long since given up trying to stop them. No one in Ashkam needed to ask where. "Not again," said the head nursemaid, already reaching for her shawl. A guard at the gate didn't even look up from his post. West wall. Give it 20 minutes. They were right, of course. They always were. By the time anyone thought to follow, the 2 pups were already past the wall, down the narrow lane no noble ever bothered to walk, scratching at a door with a small stone step, worn smooth by years of exactly this. The door opened before they finished scratching. "You smelled it from the castle," said the woman standing in it, stepping aside. "Come in before someone notices you're gone." They didn't need telling twice. Inside, the house smelled of butter and cinnamon, and something warmer underneath both. Cyrus and Cetus shifted before they'd even crossed the threshold, tumbling back into boy shape in a heap of limbs and laughter, already reaching for the table. "Pause," she said, not turning around. 2 small pairs of paws stopped, mid-reach, and retreated, an old habit that had never quite worn off, from the days when they hadn't yet learned to hold the shift for long. She didn't need to raise her voice. She never had. Both boys knew exactly how far they could push, and had already decided, the way they decided every week, not to push it. "Uncle Octan says we're not allowed to run off during lessons anymore," Cyrus announced, as if reporting a great injustice. "Uncle Octan says a lot of things." "He said it twice," Cetus added helpfully. "Then it must be very important." She set 2 small plates on the table, and did not comment on the dirt still on their hands, because some battles were not worth fighting on a full stomach. The title would have looked strange painted over a kitchen. Captain Andromeda Battle, who commanded every soldier standing between Ashkam and whatever came for it, currently occupied with the exact temperature of a pie crust. She cut 2 slices while it was still too hot to serve properly, because the twins had never once waited for anything to cool in their lives. "Careful, it'll burn your tongue." Cyrus burned his tongue immediately. Cetus watched him do it and ate his slower. Outside, a guard knocked once and let himself in without waiting for an answer. a courtesy Andromeda had stopped requiring years ago. "Captain." He glanced at the boys, then at the pie, then back at her with the resignation of a man who already knew the answer. "Found the fugitives, I take it. They found themselves. They usually do." What none of them knew, not the guard, not the boys, not Andromeda herself, standing in her own kitchen with flour still on her sleeve, was that the man who had sent that guard to fetch his nephews had, for the first time in longer than he could name, decided to come looking himself. Octan Ashkam had ruled long enough to know exactly how many minutes a council session could run before it stopped being useful, exactly how many guards a border town needed before winter, and exactly how his captain of the guard preferred her reports, short in order of urgency, no apologies attached. What he did not know was where she lived. It had never occurred to him to ask. Andromeda Battle had served this kingdom for 10 years and led it for 6, and in all that time she had become something closer to part of the machinery of the castle than a person. Utterly trusted, rarely questioned, and never once wondered about beyond the wall of her uniform. That afternoon, the twins had been missing longer than usual, long enough that Octan finally asked where they'd gone. "They're at the captain's house," his steward told him, for perhaps the 100th time that year, as if it explained everything. It did explain everything, as far as anyone else was concerned. It had simply never occurred to Octan that a 2-word answer could sit on top of an entire life he knew nothing about. "I'll get them myself," he said. The steward blinked. "My lord?" "I said I'll get them myself." He couldn't have explained why he said it. The lane past the west wall was one he'd never had reason to walk. No noble lived here. No one of any importance, as far as the maps in his study were concerned. He found the house by the sound of it before he found it by sight. Nothing dramatic. Just the low murmur of a voice, unhurried, reading something aloud. The door was unlocked. He knocked anyway, out of some instinct he didn't examine, and when no one answered right away, he let himself do the thing he told every soldier under his command never to do. He opened a door without waiting. What he found stopped him where he stood. The fire had burned down to embers, throwing more warmth than light. In front of it, curled together in a heap of white fur, both boys were asleep in their wolf shape, properly asleep. The kind of boneless, trusting sleep that small things only managed when nothing in the world felt dangerous. Andromeda sat in the chair beside them, a book open on her knee, reading in the low, even voice of someone with nowhere else to be. She hadn't noticed him yet. No armor. Sleeves rolled. Hair loose in a way he'd never once seen it at the castle. Feet tucked beneath her like the day had finally allowed her to stop standing at attention. He had seen his captain give orders to 200 men without raising her voice. He had never seen this. She looked up, unbothered, as though men appeared in her doorway on a regular basis, and none of them had ever been worth alarm. They fell asleep an hour ago. She kept her voice low. Took them 20 minutes to stop pretending they weren't tired. Octan found for a moment that he had nothing prepared to say. "They never sleep like that at the castle," he managed, quieter than he meant to. Andromeda looked down at the twins. Cyrus curled protectively half over his brother, the way he always slept, even in this shape. "I don't imagine they do. Why here?" It wasn't the question he'd meant to ask. He'd meant to ask something smaller. How long? How often? Since when? This one came out before he'd decided to let it. Andromeda considered it the way she considered most things, without hurrying toward an answer just to fill the silence. Maybe because here, nobody expects them to be future alphas. She closed the book, careful not to let it snap shut and wake either boy. They can just be tired. Nobody's watching to see how well they carry it. Octan looked at the twins. He had never thought of it that way. "I didn't know they came here every week. You never asked." There was no accusation in it. That was somehow worse than if there had been. He stepped further into the room, and it was only then that he noticed the rest of it. The herbs drying along the window, tied in small bundles he couldn't name. Books stacked with the disorder of things that were actually read, not displayed. A house that had clearly belonged to more than one person. Once, though nothing in it explained who or where they'd gone. None of it matched the captain he thought he knew. "I should let them sleep a while longer," Andromeda said, misreading, or perhaps not misreading at all, the direction of his attention. "If you wake them now, you'll carry 2 very unhappy wolves back to the castle." "I'm in no hurry." He realized, saying it, that it was true. She glanced at him, a brief, assessing look, the kind she might have given a soldier whose report didn't quite add up, and gestured without much ceremony at the chair across from hers. "Then sit. Standing in my doorway won't make them sleep any faster." He sat. It was, he would think much later, the first time in longer than he could remember that anyone had told him what to do, and he had simply done it, without weighing what it cost him to be told. The fire cracked once, low and settling. Outside, past the window, the lane was quiet in the way a place goes quiet after the sun is fully down. Andromeda didn't reach for the book again. She simply watched the fire, unhurried, as though this, a silent room, 2 sleeping pups, a king she barely knew sitting across from her, required no explanation at all. Octan found himself watching her instead. At some point, without looking away from the fire, Andromeda reached over and tucked a blanket back over Cetus's shoulder, where it had slipped in his sleep. It was such a small movement that no report would ever have mentioned it. Somehow it told Octan more than 6 years of reports ever had. He thought of waking them, however, decided against it at the same time. Some things were not worth the trouble of undoing. He would leave them by her fire tonight and come back for them at first light. The twins tucked warm by an unfamiliar hearth for once, and no one, not even the king, in any hurry to change that. The next morning, the twins woke slowly. First Cetus, blinking at the fire like he wasn't sure how he'd gotten there. Then Cyrus a moment later, immediately annoyed that his brother had woken first. "Time to go home," Andromeda said, before either boy could suggest otherwise. They didn't argue. They never did. Not with her. Though Octan suspected they argued about everything else in the world. He watched them shift back to their smaller shapes without being asked, trotting toward the door on 4 paws instead of 2, apparently having decided that walking was more efficient than complaining, which left him standing in the middle of a kitchen he had no reason to still be standing in. "There's pie left." Andromeda was already reaching for a knife. "If you want it. If you don't, I'll feed it to the twins tomorrow and they'll consider that theft." He hadn't expected to be offered anything. In 6 years, she had offered him reports, recommendations, the occasional blunt opinion he hadn't asked for and had usually needed. She had never once offered him food. I wasn't aware that was on the table. It wasn't, until just now. She cut a slice and set it in front of the chair he'd already claimed, as if his answer had never really been in question. "You looked like a man who hasn't eaten since this morning." "I haven't." "Then sit back down before you make a liar out of me." He sat. No one spoke to him like that. Not his council, not his stewards, not even the twins, who at least had the excuse of being children. Andromeda Battle handed him a plate the way she might have handed a soldier a canteen, because he needed it, not because of who he was. He ate. It was, without question, the best thing he'd eaten in longer than he could place, and he told her so. "Someone once told me a house needed a smell that made people want to come back to it." She said it simply, the way someone mentions the weather. I never stopped making it. He filed that away without asking who. Some doors closed gently enough that pushing them felt like a poor trade for whatever might be behind them. "How long have you lived in Ashkam?" he asked instead. 10 years. That was all she gave him. He recognized the shape of it, the same shape he used himself in council, when a question edged too close to something he had no intention of handing over. He let it close. "You've never asked me much of anything," she added. Not quite an accusation. "No," he admitted. "I don't think I have." Cyrus, already at the door in boy shape again, chose that moment to look back over his shoulder with the bluntness only a 6-year-old could get away with. "You should come next week, too." The kitchen went very still. Andromeda kept cutting the pie, as though she hadn't heard a word of it. Octan found, for reasons he didn't examine, that he was smiling into his plate. "We'll see." Cyrus seemed to take that as a yes, and shifted back down to 4 paws, entirely satisfied with himself. At the door, both pups waited, patient in the way only creatures who knew better than to rush a king could manage. "Thank you." Octan meant it more than the words managed to carry. "For all of it. Not just tonight." Andromeda looked at him for a moment, the same brief, assessing look she gave a report that didn't quite add up. "Most days," she said. "They make it easy." It wasn't quite an answer to what he'd thanked her for. He suspected she knew that, and had chosen it anyway. He walked the lane back toward the castle with 2 wolves trotting ahead of him in the dark. At the gate, both pups stopped and looked back, checking, the way they always did, that he was still coming. Octan glanced back once himself, at the small stone house behind him, one window still lit, warm against the dark, before he crossed through the gate and didn't look again. Chapter 2. 2 weeks passed the way most weeks did in Ashkam. Quiet mornings, familiar rounds, the twins finding their way to a certain kitchen without fail. Andromeda was making her usual patrol along the outer castle wall, the sky still pale with early light, when a rider came into view moving faster than any messenger had reason to on an ordinary morning. The rain started on a night no one thought to remember, and by the time anyone thought it worth remembering, the river had already decided the matter for them. Word reached the castle at dawn, the bridge at Hollow Bend gone, cellars flooding faster than anyone could empty them. 3 villages that would need grain and dry lumber before the week was out. "I'll take the escort." Andromeda was already in the boots she hadn't had time to change. 12 guards, 2 wagons, and a vein, if her garden can spare her. The healer could. She always could. For this kind of work. "I'm coming as well," Octan said. No one argued, though the twins made their objections known at considerable length, from the courtyard, until a nursemaid finally coaxed them back inside with the promise that pie stealing would resume the moment everyone returned. They left within the hour. The road to Hollow Bend was a full day's ride, longer with wagons, and by the 2nd mile, Octan had already noticed something he hadn't expected, how differently Andromeda existed outside the castle walls. She knew every guard in the column by name, and something about each of them besides, whose mother was recovering from a fever, whose boots needed replacing before winter, who'd gotten married in the spring and still hadn't stopped smiling about it. She rode at the front without seeming to command anything, and yet the entire column moved at her pace without anyone deciding to. "You know all of them," Octan said, somewhere past the 4th mile. "I trained most of them." "That's not quite what I asked." She glanced at him, the corner of her mouth suggesting she'd noticed the distinction, and chosen not to comment on it further. They passed through a smaller village before midday, untouched by the flood but close enough to feel it coming, people already stacking sandbags along the low end of the road. Andromeda stopped without being asked, spoke briefly to an old man directing the work, and by the time she remounted, 2 of her guards had quietly redirected the wagons to leave a sack of grain behind. "You didn't mention that to me. You were talking to the miller. I didn't want to interrupt." He hadn't noticed her leave his side. He was beginning to suspect that was rather the point. A group of children ran alongside the column for a stretch, the way children always did when soldiers passed through, and Andromeda leaned down from the saddle to answer at least 4 completely serious questions about whether wolves could ride horses, whether the king's nephews had tails, and whether she herself had ever fought a bear. Once, she told the boldest of them. It was smaller than it sounded afterward. The children seemed satisfied with this. Octan, watching, found he wanted to ask what she meant by it, and didn't, because the road was already moving on, and some things were clearly reserved for children bold enough to ask directly. By the time Hollow Bend came into view, half its rooftops dark with water past the doorsteps, smoke rising thin from whichever hearths had survived. The light was beginning to turn toward evening. Andromeda didn't slow the column. She simply straightened in the saddle, settling into the readiness of someone who had done this work before and intended to do it well again. Grain to the square first. She said it to no one and everyone. Lumber after. Yvain, you'll want the north side. That's where the water sat longest. Octan watched her give 12 people their tasks in under a minute, watched the column disperse into the flooded streets with the ease of something well practiced, and found himself, for the second time in as many weeks, simply following where she led. They worked until well past dark, grain carried, doors braced, a temporary bridge of planks laid across the worst of the flooding so the village wouldn't be cut in half until the real one could be rebuilt. Andromeda worked alongside her guards, rather than above them, and Octan, without quite deciding to, found himself doing the same, carrying sacks, holding planks steady, discovering that a king's hands were, in fact, capable of doing more than signing decrees. It was well past midnight before anyone allowed themselves to stop. They would stay 2 more days, seeing the worst of it through, before the road home, and somewhere between the flooded square and the borrowed beds in Hollow Ben's one dry inn, Octan realized he hadn't thought once about his council, his correspondence, or the crown waiting for him back in Ashkam. He had thought instead about how Andromeda battle worked exactly the same, whether she was cutting pie for 2 small wolves or hauling grain through knee-deep water, without complaint, without announcement, simply because the work in front of her needed doing. He was beginning to suspect there was no version of her that wasn't, in some quiet way, taking care of something. The worst of the work was done by the second afternoon. Grain distributed, the makeshift bridge holding, Yvain satisfied enough with the north side that she'd stopped muttering under her breath every time she passed it. The village, waterlogged and exhausted, had begun the slower work of simply living again, which left, for the first time in 2 days, an hour that belonged to no one in particular. Octan found Andromeda missing from the square sometime past midday, and asked a guard where she'd gone. And the guard, a young man named Pharaoh, who had clearly worked out something the king hadn't yet said aloud, pointed toward the low hill behind the mill without much comment. The orchard sat just beyond it, untouched by the flood, rows of apple trees heavy with early fruit against a sky finally clear of rain. Andromeda stood near the 3rd row, a basket over one arm, turning an apple over in her hand with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere she needed to be. "You disappeared," Octan said. "I didn't disappear. I walked, in full view of at least 6 people, to an orchard." She set the apple in the basket and reached for another. "That's not the same thing. No one told me where. No one asked me to report my whereabouts. I'm off duty for an hour. I intend to remain off duty for the rest of it." He found, standing there, that he had no argument prepared for that, and didn't want one. "Do you always do this?" he asked. "Find an orchard, wherever you go, whenever there's one to find." She held an apple up to the light, inspecting it the way she might inspect a soldier's kit, thoroughly, without apology. Habit. He picked one for himself, mostly for something to do with his hands, and turned it over the way he'd watched her do. For the pie. It wasn't quite a question. For the pie. He held his out to her instead of setting it in his own basket. She looked at it for a moment, longer than the gesture probably warranted, before taking it from his hand, her fingers brushing his in a way that neither of them commented on. They walked another few rows in silence. "You never asked," she said finally, "why I make it. I assumed you'd tell me if you wanted me to know. Most people ask eventually. I'm not most people. I'm considerably slower." That earned him something close to a real laugh, brief, almost startled out of her, as if she hadn't expected to find him funny and resented it slightly. He decided, watching it fade, that he wanted to hear it again. They walked further before she spoke again, Andromeda choosing apples with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, Octan mostly watching her do it. The light had gone gold with the hour. Someone once told me a house isn't really a house until it smells like something worth coming back to. She let the silence sit for a moment. My husband. Octan stopped reaching for apples entirely the week we moved into our first house together. He wasn't a romantic man. He just liked apple pie, and liked an excuse to make it a tradition. After he died, I made it the following Sunday. And the Sunday after that. Then I suppose I forgot how to stop. She said it without asking for anything in return. No comfort, no careful silence, no hand offered. She simply kept walking the row as though the conversation could continue exactly as it had before. I'm sorry, Octan said, because it was true, and because he could think of nothing else that wouldn't sound smaller than it needed to be. It was a long time ago. That's not really an answer. She looked at him then, the same brief, assessing look she gave everything, though something in it had shifted. Some door left open a fraction wider than before. No, she admitted. I suppose it isn't. She didn't say more. He didn't ask for more. But something had changed in the space between them. Quiet and undeniable. They turned back toward the village, baskets full. Andromeda's had grown heavy enough to pull at her arm, and Octan, without a word, reached over and took half the apples into his own. She glanced at him. She didn't thank him. He didn't mention it either. They walked the rest of the way in silence, and it was, without question, a different silence than the one they'd started with. They left Hollow Bend the following morning, the column lighter without the grain and lumber it had carried in, the village behind them beginning, slowly, to look like itself again. The road home passed through a market town too small to have a name worth remembering, though it had a square full of stalls that had clearly survived the flood better than Hollow Bend had. Andromeda called a short halt to let the horses drink and the wagons resupply, and Octan found himself, not for the first time on this journey, simply watching where she went. She stopped at a stall selling carved wooden toys, horses, small boats, a row of animals lined up on a cloth. The vendor, an old woman with flower-white hair, greeted her like she'd been there before. Back again, Captain. Passing through. Andromeda picked up a small wooden horse from the row, turning it over the way she'd turned the apples, thorough and unhurried. Buying? Looking. She set it down again, carefully, in exactly the spot it had come from. Octan, standing a few feet away, hadn't meant to watch as closely as he had. He noticed the way her hand had lingered on the horse a moment longer than it needed to. He noticed that she hadn't reached for any of the others. You've been here before, he said, once they'd walked on. Once or twice. She makes good toys. For the twins? No. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and didn't elaborate. He understood somehow that this was not a door closing, but a door that had simply never been fully open in the first place, a room in a house he hadn't been shown yet. He didn't ask again. They rode a long while before either of them spoke, the road unwinding through fields still damp from the flood, the light going long and low across the grass. Octan had almost let the silence settle into something ordinary when Andromeda spoke again, her eyes on the road ahead rather than on him. I had a son. Octan didn't slow his horse. He didn't stop breathing, though it felt for a moment like something in his chest had. He would have been about the twins' age now, if he'd lived. The same fever that took my husband. Her voice stayed even, the voice she used for reports, for orders, for things that needed saying without needing comfort in return. It came through our kingdom before it came through anyone else's. By the time anyone understood what it was, it had already taken most of what mattered to me. I didn't know, Octan said, because it was true, and because there was nothing else he could offer that wouldn't have sounded smaller than the moment required. No one here does. There was no reason to tell them. Is that why you came to Ashkam? I came because I needed somewhere that wasn't there. She glanced at him briefly. This kingdom didn't ask me who I'd been before I arrived. It only asked if I could hold a sword steady. I could. That was enough to start again. He thought of the twins, asleep by her fire, and the wooden horse she hadn't bought, and the pie she'd never stop making though there was no one left to make it for. "All these years," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I had the guard." Another pause, shorter than the first. "I had the boys." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. Octane understood, without her saying it, that having those things had never quite meant not being alone, and that she had long since stopped expecting the two to be the same. By the time Ashkam's walls came into view, the sun was already low, and neither of them had said much else. Cyrus and Cetus were waiting in the courtyard, and the moment Andromeda dismounted, both boys shifted and ran to her in wolf shape, throwing themselves against her legs with the abandon only children, or wolves, ever allowed themselves. She crouched without thinking, an arm around each of them. Octane watched and understood, for the first time, that the twins had likely never come to her house for the pie at all. They had simply found, long before he had, a woman who still knew how to love children without flinching from what it might cost her. Spring was supposed to be the easy season. The flood had receded weeks ago. Hollow Bend had its bridge rebuilt in timber if not yet in stone, and Ashkam had settled back into the rhythm it knew best. Gates on time, guard shifts on time, 2 small wolves finding their way to a certain kitchen with the same reliability as the sunrise. Octane had started coming with them more often than not. No one commented on it directly, though he'd noticed his steward had stopped looking surprised when he announced he was fetching the twins himself. It was Yvain who brought the first report, 3 weeks after the water had gone down, and she brought it the way she brought everything, plainly, without softening it for anyone's comfort. Fever in Millbrook. 4 households. A rash that starts behind the ears. The room went quiet, in a way rooms only went quiet for one kind of news. Octane looked, without meaning to, toward the corner where Andromeda stood. She hadn't moved. That was the first thing he noticed. Not stillness born of composure, but stillness born of something else entirely, a kind of stopping that had nothing to do with discipline. "How many households in Millbrook total?" she asked. Her voice was even. He was beginning to know her well enough to hear what evenness cost her. 11. And the water that flooded there in spring. Where did it settle? The low wells. The ones people went back to using once the clean ones ran short. Andromeda said nothing for a long moment. It started that way before, too. Contaminated water. A fever that looked mild at first. By the time anyone called it what it was, it had already reached 3 kingdoms. "This isn't the same illness," Yvain said carefully. "The rash pattern is different. The fever breaks faster in most cases." "I hope you're right." "So do I," Yvain said, and for the first time, she looked less certain than she had a moment ago. The council moved quickly after that. Quarantine measures for Millbrook, riders sent to the surrounding villages. Yvain dispatched with what supplies could be spared before nightfall. Andromeda gave orders through all of it with her usual precision, and if her hands were steadier than her voice had been, no one who didn't know her well would have noticed the difference. Octane noticed. He found her afterward in the courtyard, checking the girth on a horse that didn't need checking, her hands moving through a task they'd performed 1,000 times before, the way hands moved when the mind attached to them needed somewhere safe to be. "You don't have to ride out with the supplies," he said. "Yvain has it handled. I know. You could send someone else. I know that too." She didn't stop what she was doing. He watched her hands still, finally, resting flat against the saddle, and understood that she was not, in this moment, entirely present in the courtyard with him. That some part of her had gone somewhere 10 years, and 1 kingdom away, to a version of this exact fear that had ended very differently. Andromeda. It was the first time he'd used her name without the title in front of it. She looked up, and for just a moment, before she caught it and put it away, he saw something in her face he hadn't seen since the orchard. "I need to go," she said. "Not because Yvain can't manage it. Then why? Because if it is what I think it is, I already know what these next few weeks will look like, and I would rather be the one standing in the middle of it than the one waiting at home for word. He understood, watching her finish the girth strap with hands that had gone steady again by sheer will, that this was not a request for permission. She swung up into the saddle. He was already reaching for his own horse. She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know." He mounted and said nothing more, and neither did she. And that was somehow answer enough for both of them. Millbrook was worse than the reports had suggested, and better than Andromeda's worst imagining, which was, she supposed, the only kind of mercy this particular grief ever offered. 4 households had become 7 by the time they arrived. Yvain had already drawn a line at the village edge, rope strung between 2 posts, a marker that meant something far heavier than rope should have been able to mean. "The far cottage," Yvain said, not looking up from the child she was examining. "2 still inside. No one's gone in since yesterday." "Why not?" "Because the last person who did hasn't come back out to say whether it's safe." Andromeda looked at the cottage. Smoke rose thin from its chimney, which meant someone inside was still tending a fire, which meant someone inside was still capable of tending anything at all. "I'll go," she said. Yvain's hands stilled. "You don't know what's in there." "No, it could be exactly what we're afraid of. I know that too." She was already reaching for her boots, the ones she'd taken off an hour ago to cross the last stretch of flooded road on foot, carrying supplies the horses couldn't manage through the mud. She sat on an overturned crate and pulled them back on, methodically, 1 buckle at a time, the way she did everything that mattered. Octan found her like that. He didn't ask what she was doing. He'd learned, over these last months, to recognize the set of her shoulders that meant a decision had already been made, and discussing it further would only waste daylight. "It's too dangerous," he said anyway, because some things needed saying even when saying them changed nothing. "I know. Andromeda." "I know," she said again, and finished the 2nd buckle, and stood. She didn't look at him with defiance. That was somehow the part that stayed with him longest, that this wasn't rebellion or courage performed for an audience. It was simply the shape of a woman who had decided, a long time ago, in a kingdom that no longer existed for her, exactly what kind of person she intended to be when the worst arrived. He didn't try to stop her. He had learned that too. "I'm coming with you," he said instead. "No." For the first time since Millbrook, something sharp entered her voice. "You're the king. If this is what I think it is, Ashkam cannot lose you to it. The twins cannot lose you to it. And if it takes you instead, then let it be me." She met his eyes. "I already know how to walk into this kind of room." He wanted to argue with it anyway. He didn't, because he understood, watching her face, that this was not the moment for it, that some battles were not his to fight, only to stand beside. "Then I'll be at the rope when you come out. I know you will." She crossed the distance to the cottage alone, her boots sinking into the mud with each step, and did not look back, because looking back had never once made anything easier, and she had long since stopped pretending otherwise. Inside, an old woman sat by the fire, and beside her, wrapped in blankets too thin for the fever burning through him, a little boy slept the restless sleep of someone caught between 2 kinds of dark. Andromeda knelt beside him and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. High fever. She looked behind his ears. Nothing. For one suspended heartbeat, she closed her eyes. Then she opened the door. Yvain. Octan was still at the rope when she came out. He hadn't moved in the time it took her to check the boy, to call for Yvain, to help carry the fever down with cool cloths, and the kind of patience that came from having done this before, in a life she rarely spoke of. Hours, maybe. He hadn't counted them. He'd simply stood at the marker she'd asked him to wait behind, and waited, the way he'd promised. When she finally crossed back over the rope, her face unreadable, exhaustion sitting on her like something physical. He didn't ask if she was all right. He'd learned that question rarely got him anything true. It wasn't the same fever, she said instead, because she knew that was the question, underneath the one he hadn't asked. Yvain was right. The boy will recover. Most of them will. Most. 2 won't. An old man, and a woman who was already weak before this started. She said it plainly, the way she reported everything, though something in her voice had gone thin around the edges. It's not what we feared. It's still a loss. He didn't offer her comfort disguised as correction. He simply stood beside her and let his hand fall next to hers. She let it rest there a moment. Then, slowly, she turned her palm to meet it. Neither of them said anything about it. They stayed in Millbrook 4 more days, until the fever had run its course through the last of the affected households, and Yvain pronounced the village, cautiously, out of danger. That first night, he found her outside the healer's tent, looking up at a sky finally clear of the clouds that had followed them since the flood. He stood beside her without a word. For a long while, neither of them broke the silence. "Their names were Garrick and Thomas," she said finally. "My husband and my son. My little boy, Thomas. He loved horses. Wanted to join the Royal Guard someday, just so he could ride one every day. He had a whole shelf of toy ones. Never played with anything else. That sounds like a boy who knew what he wanted. He did." Something almost like a smile crossed her face, brief and unguarded. "It happened fast, in the end. The fever, I mean. It was the years after that took long." Octan said nothing. He understood, without needing to be told, that some griefs measured themselves not in the losing but in everything that came after. The days that followed asked little of reflection and much of work. Wells to be checked, households to be cleared one by one, Yvain moving between them with the tireless precision of someone who had stopped counting hours days ago. Andromeda worked alongside her, and Octan worked alongside both of them. And by the second night, something in the rhythm between the 3 of them had settled into something closer to ease. It was on that second night that he found her again, not outside the healer's tent this time, but sitting on an overturned crate near the last dying fire, boots off, feet bare against the cold ground. He sat beside her without asking. They talked about nothing in special. A horse she'd once trained that refused every saddle but one. A council session he'd once fallen asleep in and never admitted to. The particular stubbornness of a goat that had chased Yvain twice that week. It was the kind of conversation that existed only because neither of them needed anything from it, and somewhere in the middle of it, without either one deciding to, her shoulder had come to rest against his. Neither of them moved away from it. "I used to think that if I stopped being afraid of losing people, I'd stop being able to love them properly," she said, quieter now, as if the fear was the proof. "And now? I don't think that's true anymore." She looked at him, and for once her expression gave him nothing to interpret. It was simply open, unguarded in a way he'd rarely seen. "You stood at a rope for 6 hours without asking me to be anything other than what I am." It wasn't a declaration. She didn't say it like one. But Octan understood, hearing it, that it carried more weight than any declaration could have managed. "I would stand there again," he said, "as many times as it takes." "I know." She looked back up at the sky. "That's rather the problem, isn't it?" "Is it a problem?" "It's the kind of problem I stopped believing I was allowed to have." She said it without asking him to fix it, and he understood that some things were not meant to be fixed, only witnessed, and carried alongside. They rode back to Ashkam 2 days later. The twins were waiting in the courtyard exactly as before, and the moment Andromeda dismounted, both boys shifted and threw themselves against her, nearly taking her knees out from under her. She knelt, laughing despite herself, an arm around each of them. It was a moment before she noticed her other hand was still folded into Octan's. She looked up. He looked down. They let go at the same time, and neither of them mentioned it. "We missed you," Cyrus said, muffled against her shoulder. "I missed you too." Octan, watching her say it, felt something settle in his chest that he had no name for. Not the restlessness he'd carried for weeks, and not quite relief either. Something steadier than both. Spring came late that year, though when it finally arrived, it arrived all at once. The orchards outside Ashkam breaking into blossom within the same week, the roads dry enough for travel, the twins declaring, with the confidence of 7-year-olds who had clearly been waiting for the correct moment to say so, that they were entirely too old to still be called pups. Andromeda still called them that. They no longer argued the point. 6 months had passed since Millbrook. Long enough for grief to settle back into its familiar shape. Long enough for the fear that had lived in Andromeda's chest since Yvain's first report to loosen its grip, though she suspected some part of it would never fully let go, and had stopped expecting it to. Long enough, too, for Octan to have asked her the question she'd been quietly waiting for since the night beneath that clear sky in Millbrook. He hadn't made a production of it. She would have refused him if he had. Instead, he'd found her in her own kitchen on an ordinary morning, flour on her hands, and asked if she'd consider spending the rest of her life somewhere that wasn't quite as far from the castle. "I like where I live," she'd said. "I'm not asking you to leave it." She'd set down the rolling pin then, slowly, and looked at him the way she looked at very little in her life, without any calculation at all. "You're not asking me to become someone else's version of a queen either, are you?" "No." He'd said it plainly, the way she said most things herself. "I'm asking you to be my wife. The person I want beside me for the rest of my life. Nothing more complicated than that." She hadn't answered him with words. A kiss was her answer. Yes came in the form of action. They gave themselves a month to arrange what could reasonably be arranged in a month, which turned out to be most of it. A dress finished in a fortnight, an archway of blossom Yvain swore up and down she'd had nothing to do with, and a guest list Octan cut in half twice before Andromeda finally told him to stop asking her opinion on people she'd never met. The wedding itself was smaller than the court expected, and larger than Andromeda had wanted, which she understood was the nature of compromise when one person was a king. It was held in the courtyard, rather than the grand hall, at her request, beneath an archway of apple blossom someone, she suspected Yvain, had gone to considerable trouble to arrange. The twins stood at the front, insisting on their boy shapes for the entire ceremony, despite the temptation of a crowd. And Octan stood beside them looking, for once, entirely unlike a king, and entirely like a man who had waited a long time to stop pretending he didn't know what he wanted. When it came time to speak, he did not give the kind of speech expected of him. He kept it short, the way she'd have wanted it. "For years, I believed I knew the woman standing beside me. I knew the captain. I knew her reports. I knew her judgment. I knew I could trust her with my kingdom." He paused. "What I didn't know was that she'd quietly built the only place I ever found myself wanting to return to." Andromeda, who had prepared nothing to say and had not expected to need to, found that the only thing worth saying was true enough to need no preparation at all. "For a long time, I thought loving again meant leaving part of my life behind." Her voice didn't shake, though something in it had gone quieter than usual. "It doesn't. Thank you for never asking me to." It was not the kind of vow most weddings offered. The court, unused to plain speech at such occasions, seemed uncertain how to receive it. The twins were not uncertain at all. Cyrus and Cetus called out at exactly the same moment, tripping over each other's words. "Does this mean you're our aunt now? Wait, does that make her our aunt?" The laughter that followed broke whatever formal tension had gathered in the courtyard, even the twins joining in once they realized they'd asked the same question twice. And Octan, laughing along with it, reached for Andromeda's hand, not tentatively this time, not testing whether she'd let him, simply certain that she would. She did. There is something in the morning that follows a wedding, quieter than the day before. though nothing in the castle had actually gone silent. The apple blossoms were still scattered across the courtyard stones. Somewhere, a steward was already fretting over a guest list for a feast that had, in fact, already happened. Andromeda was not in the castle that morning. She had moved into Octan's rooms within the castle walls the week before the wedding, as a king's wife was expected to. But some habits refused to be left behind so easily, and every Sunday since, without fail, she found her way back to the small stone house past the west wall, the one place that had never asked her to be anyone's queen. Octan had stopped pretending he didn't follow her there. She was in her own kitchen, exactly where she had been every Sunday for 10 years. Sleeves rolled, flour on her hands, an apron over a dress far plainer than the one she'd worn the day before. Octan found her there. He stood in the doorway a moment before she noticed him. The same doorway he'd once stood in, uncertain, discovering for the first time that his captain had an entire life he knew nothing about. He knew every corner of it now. The herbs by the window, the wooden horse on its shelf, the chair by the fire that had become, without either of them deciding it, his. "I thought you might rest today," he said. "It's Sunday." She didn't look up from the pastry. He hadn't really expected her to. He crossed the room and did what he had learned, over the better part of a year, to do without asking. He reached into the cupboard and took down 4 plates, setting them exactly where they belonged, because he had learned where they belonged the way a person learns the shape of a house that has quietly become theirs. Andromeda noticed. She said nothing. She simply smiled, the small private smile she rarely let anyone see, and reached for the apples. The knock came before the pie had even gone into the oven, not that it needed to, not anymore, not for 2 boys who had never once waited to be invited in. Cyrus and Cetus came through the door on 4 paws, tails already high, noses lifted toward the smell that had called them here every week of their lives. One went straight for the hearth, circling twice before settling as he always did. The other shifted back to boy shape long enough to ask, with the impatience of a child who had asked this question 1,000 times and never once tired of it. "Is it almost ready?" "It just went in. You know that." "I was hoping it might be different this time." "It never is." He seemed to accept this as reasonable, and curled up beside his brother by the fire, and Octan, watching the 2 of them settle into a house that had never once required them to be anything other than tired children, understood something he had somehow needed a year to learn. They had never come here for the pie. Not really. They had come because this was the one place in the whole of Ashkam where no one asked them to be small kings. And somewhere in the past year, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, it had become the one place Octan didn't have to be a king either. Some stories end with crowns. Some end with victories. This one ends exactly where it always belonged. It was the story of a woman who rebuilt a life so quietly that the people around her mistook her resilience for the absence of sorrow. And it was the story of a king who discovered that the greatest privilege of his life was not ruling a kingdom, but being welcomed into a house where he never had to earn the right to stay. Some people spend their whole lives searching for somewhere that feels like home. Octan found his just beyond the western wall of his own castle. And every Sunday after that, the pie came out of the oven exactly on time, as it always had, as it always would. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. I know Andromeda isn't the kind of woman you usually find at the center of these tales. She doesn't wait by a window. She doesn't need saving. She commands armies. She buries her own grief without asking anyone to carry it for her. And somehow, in the middle of all that, she still notices the small things. A tired guard, a frightened child, 2 boys who only ever wanted somewhere they didn't have to be princes. I think that's exactly why this one stayed with me. Strength and softness were never opposites. A woman can hold a sword all day and still be the reason someone else feels seen by nightfall. If this story found its way to you, I'd love it if you'd leave a like. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. There's always another story waiting here, another door for someone to finally knock on. Until next time. With love, Evelyn.